In the streets of Paris, two Chinese women, heavily made up, scan their surroundings for lurking clients. Compared to the local streetwalkers in France, they, hailing from a foreign land, are more favored by French customers. Among this group of people, they are not merely selling their bodies for money. Welcome to Oriental Frames. Thank you for your watching and subscribing. In China, during the 1990s, there was a wave of layoffs, and this family was just an ordinary family caught in the midst of this upheaval. While her husband could do labor-intensive, dirty, and tiring jobs to make ends meet, life left wife Lina with no choice but to seek an alternative path. She heard that working as a nanny in Paris could earn her 2,000 euros per month, which was equivalent to over a year's worth of earnings for a Chinese worker at the time. Consequently, Lina quickly borrowed a high-interest loan and set off for the foreign land of Paris under the guise of a group tour. Everything here seemed so unfamiliar and fascinating to her. However, she had no time to enjoy the sights. While the tour guide was describing the scenery, Lina discreetly left the group. With her passport still in the tour group's possession, she became an undocumented immigrant. But as she pinned her hopes on her career, hoping to establish herself through finding employment, Lina discovered that the wages for nannies here were a mere maximum of 550 euros per month. The idea of getting rich through this profession was nothing but a bubble. In despair, she first went to work for a Chinese employer, hoping to receive some support from her fellow countrymen. The reality, however, was brutal. The accommodation provided by the employer was a cluttered room, making it challenging to even stand up and turn around. Yet, there were still people willing to accept such work. When Lina finally reached her payday, the employer deducted 100 euros, citing a vase she had supposedly broken. In reality, it was the employer's son who had broken the vase, but Lina was held responsible. The insults against Lina didn't end there. The female employer berated northeastern people as clumsy, all while suggesting that if Lina didn't like it, she could go sell her body on the streets. Faced with this kind of treatment, Lina couldn't bear it any longer. She clutched her meager earnings and left immediately. Carrying her luggage, Lina aimlessly roamed the streets. She entered a Chinese restaurant by chance, where the restaurant owner and a northeastern female customer were in a dispute. The restaurant owner casually remarked that northeastern people couldn't communicate. This reignited the anger that had only just subsided within Zhang Lina. She let loose a torrent of angry words at the restaurant owner. At that moment, the northeastern female customer stepped in and called Lina over. Her name was May, and because they were both from the northeast, they immediately felt a sense of kinship. May brought Lina back to her residence, a small room with bunk beds, where middle-aged women from the northeast lived. The landlord emphasized some rules and offhandedly added that no guests were allowed. Lina immediately understood that they were all streetwalkers. Reluctantly, she paid 125 euros in rent for a week. Although there was no obvious disdain from the others, Lina, who had always lived a pure life, felt somewhat awkward. Even though, during her conversations with May, she learned that all of them had been forced into this line of work by life circumstances, Zhang Lina still couldn't bring herself to join their ranks. She continued to fervently search for a regular job. At night, the streetwalkers openly discussed their work experiences, while Zhang Lina gazed at photos of her children, easing her homesickness. It was her primary motivation for staying in this situation. In reality, most of the women in this room had unhappy marriages, either having been divorced or widowed. Among them, Lina appeared to be the one with the most hope. May urged Lina to return to China and take her time to repay the debts, but Lina knew that going back at this point would make it even harder to settle her obligations. Lina insisted on staying and began visiting various establishments on the street, hoping someone would give her a chance. However, for someone with no special skills and no knowledge of the French language, it wasn't easy to be accepted. After several rejections, her health deteriorated, and she eventually fell ill with a high fever. As she lay in bed, she saw the other women in the room, all dolled up and ready to go to work. It was then that Lina realized they were all streetwalkers. Reflecting on recent events, her husband had mortgaged their only property to pay off their debts, and reality had crushed her last shred of dignity. Lina decided to enter the red light district for work. She discreetly followed May and learned how to negotiate, memorizing the gestures and conversations with clients. Once Pandora's box was opened, it seemed less terrifying. Lina began receiving clients secretly, and when the time came to pay rent, she could finally afford an additional month. In her heart, though, she still felt different from the others. She reminded herself that as soon as she repaid the high-interest loan, she would wash her hands of this and return home to her family. Most of the time, Lina stayed in her small space alone. May encouraged her to relax, reminding her that they were all in this together. She shared her experiences in the business, such as not getting into strangers' cars, as they could be undercover police. Lina pretended not to understand, but she couldn't escape May's watchful eye. Now, Lina could negotiate prices with clients using simple gestures, and everything seemed to flow naturally. She believed that she would soon repay all her debts. But life was never as beautiful as people imagined. During a transaction with a client who wanted to record the encounter, Lina resisted vehemently, but the client still assaulted her. In Yume's arms, she finally broke down and cried. However, it was of little use, as nobody could help her bear this burden. So, the two women decided to work together and provide mutual support. Over time, Lina also saved some money to send back home. She imagined her family receiving those stacks of bills, and for the first time, she smiled from the bottom of her heart. Lina and Yume rented a room together specifically for receiving clients, and the monthly rent was 1,500 euros. Before this, she would never have dared to think about such high rent, but this time, she agreed without hesitation. It was because she now had money, but also because from this room's window, she could see the Eiffel Tower. She thought that living here meant she could tell her husband and children that even at her workplace, she could enjoy such magnificent views. She thought about returning home as soon as she had repaid her debts, completely ending her current life. She wrote letters to her family and attached photos of herself at the Eiffel Tower, without revealing the truth to her husband. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye, and her family had already repaid their loans, with their living conditions considerably improved. Her husband had opened a small store at home. The couple frequently had video calls, talking about the beauty of life in the presence of envious onlookers. On Chinese New Year's Eve, they gathered to make dumplings, discussing when they would return to China. An older woman said that if they could return, even if they died, they wanted to die in northeast China. However, this statement cast a shadow over everyone's faces. To lighten the mood, they all started singing songs. Recently, Lina's relative, Dandan, heard that working as a nanny in Paris could earn a lot of money and wanted to come and work. What made it impossible for Lina to refuse was that Dandan's husband, Gaofei, had already completed all the paperwork. Like Lina, Dandan had come with a tour group. Dandan was curious about everything in this new place, but the difference was that she wasn't alone. Subsequently, Lina brought Dandan to the place where she received clients, pretending it was her place as a nanny. Just like the others working in different places, family members would often send various local products and letters from their children. After reading the letters, Lina smiled, but then tears welled up in her eyes. She started arranging a job for Dandan, hoping to find her a good one. However, things didn't go as planned, and the prices were still low, which led to Dandan expressing her disappointment. But that was exactly what Lina wanted to hear, as she was secretly hoping to discourage Dandan from working here. However, what Lina didn't expect was that Dandan, just like her in the beginning, had come to a foreign country with a heavy debt load. Regardless, she couldn't go back. Reluctantly, Lina finally revealed her own line of work.
你看那边街口那女的没？干啥呢？站街呢，跟我们一样。
At this point, Dandan realized that she truly had no way out. She found herself completely unsuited for this line of work and, having fallen to this extent, directed all her resentment toward Lina. Lina was also concerned that Dandan might inform her family, but she couldn't simply ignore her. Dandan was a traditional woman who had only shared a bed with her husband, and now, circumstances forced her to break with these traditional views for the sake of survival. They each had their husbands encouraging them from the other end of video calls, and Dandan had to swallow her bitterness. She made an excuse about having work to attend to and stepped aside. She had no idea how Lina could calmly face her husband as if nothing were amiss. She questioned her own ability to do the same. Every time she returned from a client, she could hear her husband's voice in her mind. She was genuinely afraid that if her husband were to learn the truth, he might no longer want her. Each night, her breathing was accompanied by her tears, and Zhang Lina worried about this constantly. So she decided to take Dandan back to China with her. However, when her husband saw his wife returning, he wasn't happy because they would have to tighten their belts to repay the debt. But to Lina's surprise, her husband had prepared something special. Their newly acquired store was undergoing renovations. In Lina's husband's heart, the dream was finally becoming a reality. The new house at home, as Lina entered it for the first time, and upon seeing their own children, she was overjoyed. While taking a shower, she meticulously cleaned every inch of her skin, wanting to wash away the past and fearing her husband might notice something. She even considered rejecting him that night. Sunlight shone on her face, and she felt a brightness and warmth she had never experienced before. This home had everything she had ever wanted, and her parents also came by occasionally to gather, finally allowing them to enjoy family meals together. However, this time, her husband wasn't there because he had gone out with Dandan's husband, and they weren't answering their phones. Suddenly, Lina understood that the thing she had feared most had indeed happened.
别给我装了！我这脊梁骨就被戳爆了，那媳妇都卖到国外去了，还舔着脸搁那儿美呢。
你别他妈瞎说了，行，别说了。
都他妈这他妈美了个逼玩意儿，啥呀？这是啥呀？
It turned out that under pressure from Dandan's husband, Dandan had confessed everything. Therefore, Lina's husband, who understood the situation, left home. Suddenly, she realized her husband had left, and she knew nothing about her children. So, she had to send the children to live with their grandmother. The renovation of the store had to continue, and she could only tough it out. Her room was empty again, with only her left. Lina didn't know what it was all for, and she had to console Dandan to prevent the couple from quarreling, as their child wasn't very close to her either. Finally, Lina's husband called their child, but when he heard Lina's voice, he fell silent. The day they saw her husband again, it was snowing. She hoped for a reunion after a long separation, just like a honeymoon. In this shabby little inn, her husband was particularly excited to see their child little Dong, but Lina didn't even look at him. They went to cook noodles for their child. Faced with her husband's resolute attitude, Lina still helped her husband with the work. Although they had nothing to say to each other, in the seemingly awkward atmosphere, this might be a silent reconciliation. If they had the choice, Lina and her colleagues would certainly not choose to engage in prostitution as undocumented immigrants in a foreign country. But they had no choice. Even today, there are still over 1,000 Chinese women selling sex on the streets of Paris, and their average age is over 45. Unusually, they all engage in this voluntarily, perhaps for survival, perhaps for their families back in distant China. No voiceover can replicate the charm of the original film. A great movie deserves to be experienced in its full plot. Thank you for your watching and subscribing.